Good morning, everyone. I always try to check with my students as well when I start a lecture. Good morning, everyone's quiet. But good morning, everyone. It's warmer inside here than it is outside, which is a good thing. It's a rainy Monday. It's my pleasure to welcome you all for this seminar, which is co-hosted by the AFRICAP program and Lucas, the Center for African Studies. And my name is Adrian Lincoln. I'm the director of the Center for African Studies here at Leeds. And I'm very pleased to be chairing this session this morning. In particular, I'm excited to welcome our speaker, Dr. Pedi Obani, who has come from, she is indeed just part of a UK trip for a couple of weeks, but she has come from Accra, and I will introduce her in a minute. Just very briefly about a seminar which is part of the AFRICAP series of monthly seminars, if I'm correct. And this is actually the first one that we are co-hosting together between the AFRICAP program and the Leeds University Center for African Studies. And I'm really excited that Pedi's email, when she initially approached us, provided us with this opportunity to actually do something that I've been planning for a while when I became director of Lucas. To actually start building the connections with other parts of the university where really interesting and exciting Africa-focused research takes place. So for those of you who are new to AFRICAP, AFRICAP stands for Agriculture and Food System Resilience, Increasing Capacity and Advising Policy. And it is a major interdisciplinary program funded by the UK government's Global Challenges Research Fund. And that's by the University of Leeds and the Food, Agriculture and Natural Resources Policy Analysis Network, headquartered in Pretoria. AFRICAP has an excellent website which offers a range of resources, so I would recommend you to browse through the website just to make yourself familiar with all the exciting activities that are planned, all the exciting research that's undertaken by members of the network, etc. Lucas is the Leeds University Center for African Studies, which brings together academics from across the university, 3 different faculties, I think 10 or 12 different schools, with an interest in research and teaching in focused studies. The center runs a couple of undergraduate and postgraduate modules with a focus on African studies, in which some AFRICAP members actually participate and contribute to. We also have an active research community, a postgraduate research community. So if anyone is a postgraduate researcher who would like to be part of the postgraduate student network in Lucas, please get in touch with me. Our speaker of today, Dr. Pedi Obani, is a research fellow at the United Nations University, the Institute for Natural Resources in Africa, which is based in Accra, in Ghana. And her research interests include promoting inclusive development and environmental sustainability, mainly through an analysis of multi-level governance, legal pluralism, and the application of transdisciplinary research methodology. She has extensive experience working in multidisciplinary research teams to assess the impact of laws, policies, and other regulatory systems for the governance of human and natural systems. Prior to joining the United Nations University, she was employed as a lecturer in law at the University of Benin from 2012. She has worked with several regional and international NGOs and government agencies in an advisory capacity on issues of environmental sustainability and social justice. She has worked extensively on sustainability issues relating to human rights, on issues of water and sanitation, climate change adaptation, and the governance of natural resources in Nigeria. She has also developed a framework for assessing the impact of human rights instruments on social, relational, and ecological improvements. A widely published academic, she has been involved in curriculum development and sustainable development goals in partnership with the University of Manchester, and the online course that is coming out of that program will be launched later this year. She sits on the advisory board of the Initiative for Equality, is a member of the board of directors for Sustainable Trends Environmental International Foundation, and has recently, just a couple of days ago before the weekend, delivered the 2019 African Studies Association UK Mary Kingsley Sokonis Lecture, which is the highest honor you can have as a visiting African Studies lecture academic in the UK. It's a very prestigious lecture, the most prestigious lecture that the ASA UK organizes annually. So we are extremely pleased to that you made time as part of your UK trip to visit us here at Leeds, to share with us your research, and for us to engage with the work that she is doing on the topic of adaptation strategies to flooding in low-income urban settlements. The floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Adrian, for the warm introduction. I'm grateful to AFRICAP and the Leeds Center for African Studies for the invitation. I'm happy to be here. I plan to learn from all of you here today. What I want to do is to show you my work, what I've found out about adaptation strategies to flooding in low-income settings, primarily in Benin City in Nigeria. And the idea for me is to see how best these strategies can be strengthened to become more sustainable. And I really believe that it's something that will require more than just the legal framework, and it would require interventions by other disciplines as well. And you'll see why in the next few minutes. How many of us ever heard of Fela? Yes, so some people say he's the king of Afrobeat, right? And one of his very popular tracks is titled Water No Get Enemy. It essentially means that water is important to everyone in different spheres of life. It shows that water can't really do harm. But then when we think about flooding in the context of climate change, in the context of extreme weather events, we see that sometimes there are dangers that come out of water. And then the issue then becomes that, is it because of the water in itself, or is it because of social issues, structural issues, problems with social ecological systems? And I'd like to think that it's more because of problems with the social ecological systems. Now, with climate change, weather events, extreme rainfall, increase in rainfall, there's likelihood of more and more flooding occurring in different areas. When it happens in urban settings, it becomes a problem because of the concentration of people, concentration of livelihoods, and because the systems aren't really built to cope with this problem. Now, to a large extent, a lot of studies have been carried on in the area of sustainable water management. And the idea is to see how best water resources, stormwater, wastewater can be used as a resource as against a problem in the society. And these days, there's more and more work going on in seeing how urban centers or urban landscapes can be adapted to flooding, so that flooding is no longer a disruptive event, but it's something that the systems, the structures can actually cope with as it happens. The outline of the presentation is going to focus just a general introduction to Benin City, because that's where most of the research has been conducted. And then I'm going to talk about the governance structure for urban management in general and flooding in particular in the context of Benin. And then I'll try to explain the coping strategies that I've noticed, and then the probable pathways to cooperation and how to enhance these adaptation strategies. Now, Benin City is the capital of Edo State in Nigeria. It's in the Niger Delta region, and it occurs very often. There's flash flooding that occurs. There's a lot of rainfall, really, really heavy rainfall. Adrian was talking about the rainfall. You know, it's been raining since I got to the UK, but for me, it's just drizzles because it really rains. And when it rains, you know, you have flooding, and the flooding often occurs because the drainage system is blocked, or because people have built on the floodplains, because of those issues. So that's why I mentioned from the beginning that we often talk about flooding in the context of an environmental problem, but it is more a socio-ecological problem, because if the right structures were in place, then the flooding wouldn't be as disruptive as it tends to be. I tried to get this map to show you, if you can just, so I work at the university. He mentioned that I lecture at the University of Benin, and on this map, if I can do this, this is the University of Benin, and just try to take note of this road. So it's an express road. It's the main road that links from the Niger Delta, Port Harcourt. I don't know if those who may have heard about Port Harcourt. So it's the main road. It's the main expressway if you have to travel by road from the south to the west. So if you had to go from Port Harcourt to Lagos, for instance, I think people would have heard about Lagos. This is the road you would fly. Now, when it comes to flood management or urban management generally in Nigeria and in the context of Benin, the responsibility is borne by different levels of government. So the federal government, the state government, we have three main levels of government: federal, state, and local, and each of them has responsibilities for ensuring that the urban space is well managed, and then issues of flooding and other environmental or socio-ecological problems are also well taken care of. In the context of this, it is the responsibility of these organs or levels of government to ensure that structures are well planned, and then if people have to build properties or erect structures, they get the proper licenses, and the buildings are located in places that do not disrupt natural systems or cause problems such as flooding. And this occurs for the federal, at the national level, it occurs within the spaces that are controlled by the national government. At the state level, it occurs within the spaces that are controlled by the state governments. And at the local level, it occurs within the spaces that are controlled by the local government. But then, as you can imagine, it's really difficult to tell where each of these jurisdictions start and end. It's easy on paper, but in terms of practicalities, it's difficult to tell where it starts and where it ends. This road, for instance, the picture is not very clear, but this road is the expressway, which I just showed you on that map. Now, you would imagine that this is an expressway, so it's a federal road. But at the same time, right next to it, you have businesses that are being controlled by the state government. So you see, the demarcation isn't really clear-cut in practice. Secondly, there's incoherence between the formal rules and the practice. So while it's stated in the laws that you can't erect a building or a structure without the permission of the state government or the federal government or the local government, depending on whose jurisdiction it falls under, in practice, people go ahead and erect structures, erect buildings as it suits them. And the next thing is that in terms of enforcement, it's very minimal. So because the enforcement is very minimal, you find that the responsible authority may overlook these issues or overlook these practices. And so there's a disconnect between how the buildings should be erected or how structures should be planned and how it actually works in practice. And at the end of the day, there's also a minimal interaction between the formal rules and the informal rules. So a lot of the times, people put up these buildings, people respond to problems such as flooding based on their own understanding of the local context or the environmental conditions, and not necessarily based on the so-called sound science, which motivates the planning laws and planning regulations generally. Now, at the end of the day, we find that a lot of the solutions which are put into the laws or the basis of the laws in themselves are very technical. So even when the government talks about addressing the flooding challenge or talks about urban management, it's usually spoken about in terms of technical structures, engineering solutions, stormwater management, drainage systems, things like that. But a major component, which is a less technical component, for instance, people's individual capacities or people's knowledge of environmental uncertainty isn't really accounted for in the process. And when you couple that with the problem of lack of enforcement, you find that there's a disconnect because if on the one hand, the government isn't really enforcing the laws, and on the other hand, the law doesn't take into consideration that people are going to act based on their own understanding or based on their capacity or based on their perception of the environmental problems or the possible risks that come out of their actions, then the law isn't properly suited to addressing these problems. And that is what we find here. So the focus is usually on technical solutions and the non-technical solutions are left out, whereas people respond to the problems usually based on non-technical factors. And these factors would include, for instance, the kind of resources they have. It would include their knowledge of how to deal with these problems. It would also include their perception of the level of risk that they are being exposed to. And these are all non-technical issues, like I already mentioned. Now, I've tried to look at the coping strategies which people adopt, and I've tried to conceptualize it. And from my observation, I find that it usually tilts between people responding positively to their knowledge of environmental uncertainty and their perception or understanding of other people's behaviors or people responding negatively to that. And so I have this table here that talks about insignificant intensity and significant intensity. In that corner, we have isolation. And isolation I describe as a situation in which people really don't care or know about environmental uncertainty so much. They're faced with the problem of flooding. And once faced with the problem, they just take actions. And this action is usually based on what they perceive as their own interests. So they're not acting based on an understanding of the problem in itself or an understanding of what other people are doing, but based on what they think will suit their purposes better. And on the other hand, on the other spectrum, we have competition. In that case, people understand the problem and they probably know that their neighbors are conducting certain actions or their neighbors are carrying out certain actions to protect themselves. But then they take actions that will maximize their own protection or maximize their own benefits and minimize their risk, irrespective of what is going on with other people. At the bottom, we have alliance. Sometimes people actually get involved. So you have communities coming together and trying to maybe have meetings where they try to reach collective goals or collective actions on how to address the flooding problem they are facing. So in that situation, some individuals will get involved. But when it comes to actual implementation, they back out and instead they just do what suits them. And sometimes they back out because they think maybe the costs which they are meant to pay is too much, or maybe they think their exposure to the risk is not as great as the exposure of their neighbors, and as such, it doesn't really serve them so well to get involved and pay so much. But the ideal situation is cooperation, and cooperation would entail a situation in which an individual understands what the environmental uncertainty is, and also understands how the neighbors or other people in their environment are adjusting or coping, and then takes the best action in terms of the collective good as against trying to maximize personal benefits. So this is the theoretical basis of my analysis. Now, for me, this is an example of isolation, and it would be where, for instance, someone was to build a barrier around private property. If you look at this picture, the one on the other corner, to the left, that's the petrol station. Now, the first picture I showed, where I showed the expressway with the flooding problem, different people started building things around their properties to sort of protect themselves from the flood. So the petrol station, this used to be a road. It was a rough road, it wasn't tarred, but it was passable. Now, once the flooding problem started, the petrol station built a barrier around itself. And then this new building on the side, you can notice something like a fence. It's coming up slowly. They also built another barrier, around their property. As a result of that, the water would just be on the road, stagnant water. And over time, this is what has happened. So the road has become impassable because each of the people affected by the problem started to act in isolation. Now, in terms of competition, that was used to be a tarred road, also part of the expressway, but you see it's chopping away because some people started channeling the water from their private property. And over time, the water would wear off the road, and this is what has happened. So competition has also led to problems in terms of compounding the collective problem, whereas individuals are benefiting in one way or the other because their level of exposure is minimized. Now, alliance, like I said, is a situation in which people come together, engage in the discussions, but do what suits them. So, for instance, this person has built this thing just so that they can pass through because they do not want to contribute to the collective goal or collective cost. If you notice, there's some building going on there. So even with the fact that the road is impassable, people still go ahead and develop their properties because they think that they can cope by themselves and they're not really worried about the collective problem. Now, the implications of this is mortality, morbidity, loss of income. For instance, this used to be a shop, but now it's closed because there's no one passing through that road anymore, so they really can't sell their goods. This used to be a petrol station, but you see, it's almost blocked off because they have to put a lot of things in front of them and people can't drive in. So at the end of the day, they're losing their businesses. This used to be a wood shed. They used to sell wood, but now it's a ghost of itself. People don't go there anymore. And this used to be the front of someone's house, but there's practically no road there anymore. So they've had to find another way of leaving their property because they can't drive out of here anymore. So the losses are enormous, and it's not just at the level of the environment, but it also affects livelihoods. It affects health, because when you have stagnant water like that, mosquitoes and other kinds of vectors breed in the environment, and this exposes the people in that environment to the problem. So at the end of the day, even those who think they may have protected themselves from the problem are actually exposed to other risks as well. So for me, I see that there are different pathways that are possible, and the main thing will be to try to get to cooperation. Now, like I mentioned in the beginning, a lot of the times the law is almost blind to the non-technical aspects of addressing the flooding problem. But the ideal situation would be to see how to move from competition, isolation, alliance to cooperation. And I know that within the sciences, for instance, people who are into programming, there are already pathways and processes being developed to see how best to chart the pathways towards cooperation. And for me, I think there's something here where the different disciplines, those in sciences, for instance, into programming, can come together and then inform. Because if the law takes into cognizance the different pathways that could lead to cooperation, then the laws, the policies will be better suited to making sure that people's behaviors are to making sure that people are motivated or incentivized to ensuring cooperation as against alliance, isolation, or competition. Essentially, isolation, a case in which people just remain by themselves and refuse to or are unaware of other people's actions or environmental uncertainty and therefore carry out conduct that creates more problems, can be addressed through knowledge dissemination. So it would mean, for instance, that such individuals should be exposed to a better understanding of what the risks are and exposed to a better understanding of what the potential solutions that would be more sustainable are. In terms of competition, it will be necessary to find ways of negotiating strategies or positions with people because clearly someone who's competitive already understands the risks and understands other people's behaviors, but isn't really interested in working together with them. But if you can find ways of ensuring negotiation and actually promoting win-win solutions for people, such that they may suffer short-term losses, but if they understand that in the long term the solutions would be preferable for everybody, then we can see how to move from competition to cooperation. And with alliance, competition would also require, so at the first level, it would require, first of all, ensuring that there's first order learning. So knowledge people already have, try and reinforce it and even improve on it. But there also has to be second order learning in terms of trying to change assumptions. So people have to be convinced that continuing in their current practices is actually counterproductive. And there has to be third order learning in the sense that people have to actually imbibe the new behaviors, the new knowledge, and new practices that leads to transformative solutions that are sustainable and applied equally to everyone to ensure that they are better protected from flooding problems. In terms of alliance, there has to be integration because when we talk about alliance, people are already involved in the process of trying to reach a solution, but they're just not integrating their solutions with collective solutions for the maximum collective good. So the idea would be to try and ensure that there's better integration between individual responses and practices and the collective responses and practices that would actually improve resilience or adaptation and minimize the risks for everyone. And finally, when it comes to cooperation, if we already have a case of cooperation, which we do not have yet, then the idea would be to build on what already exists to ensure that people continue to work together. And so for me, in my analysis of the situation, I think two main variables that are very critical to enhancing adaptation strategies is knowledge and then cooperation. Because if people have a better understanding of these uncertainties and a better understanding of the kinds of approaches and tools that will improve their protection or improve their resilience or adaptation to flooding problems, then they are very likely to use them. But they may be constrained by the capacity or the resources to actually take into account or implement the solutions they want. So one of them is knowledge, and then the other one is capacity. So for me, I think that the law can try and foster strong social networks. So instead of focusing only on technical solutions or engineering solutions to the flooding problems, in addition to that, there also has to be an emphasis on building strong social networks within which people have knowledge, social networks within which people are able to deter action that is counterproductive for the collective good and only emphasizes individual benefits. A social network within which people who actually engage in collective good or collective actions are actually encouraged to persist in that behavior. Because at the end of the day, if we allow or encourage or create an environment that promotes the individual good over the collective good, then the flooding problem would persist. So for me, the take home is addressing flooding is not just a technical issue, but it also has to do with non-technical factors as well. And two very important non-technical factors are knowledge and capacity. And the law has to respond to this non-technical aspects as well. And I think that there's room for the technical aspects or the engineering fields, the technical fields to build on the understanding of pathways from different behavioral patterns to promote sustainable responses that ensure that resilience is built for flooding, because this is a problem that is most likely going to continue in different parts of the world. And the maximization of individual benefits is also very likely to continue. So there has to be a way of reducing that emphasis on individual benefits or individual risk minimization and focusing more on the collective. Because at the end of the day, as we've seen from these cases, as much as people may in the short term protect themselves, in the long term, they are more likely to compound the problems and even face more risks themselves.
Thank you so much for a very interesting presentation, for taking us to Benin and introducing us to the problem of flooding, but also to come up with a possible solution, a way of addressing the problem. And thank you for sticking so much to time, which is excellent because it gives us time to engage in a discussion, to raise your questions, comments, suggestions, etc. Anyone who would like to kick off?
You said I based the cities on a delta. I'd just like to ask if the flooding's got worse in recent years and if it's affected by climate change in that respect, and if that's kind of made worse by management practices like deforestation or anything within, I guess, the region or the state, whether that's affected it and made it more of a problem for people to manage.
Thank you very much. So yes, it's in the delta, and while there are environmental aspects to the problem, so for instance, climate change no doubt must have contributed to the problem, there are also changes in land use patterns. So for instance, people are cutting down forests to build structures, because this area I showed very many years ago, it was just forests really, but over time it has become densely populated, so more and more people are coming in. It's a fast developing area. But beyond that, there's also the problem of social practices. So the fact that people build in places where they shouldn't build, or the fact that, so some of the people I spoke with told me that very many years ago, there were tunnels, that used to serve as drainage systems for the road. But somehow those got blocked because people built in places where they shouldn't have built. So even the technical solutions that used to be there to manage the problem have now over time either become lost or become damaged or gotten out of use. So the problem has become compounded at different levels. At the environmental level, no doubt with climate change, but there's also the social aspects of it as well. And that's why I'm saying it has to be seen more as a socio-ecological problem, because if you look at it mostly as climate change strictly, then chances are that we will persist in the technical solutions and then maybe just talk about things like reforestation. But even if you do that, the problem now exists already, so it won't go away except there's both technical and non-technical solutions together. So it's gotten worse, and it's gotten worse because of both environmental aspects and then social aspects as well. Thank you.
Sorry. I was going to say, I guess if you see part of a corporation, do you think that in order to get people to cooperate, would that come down from like a federal level? Do you think to kind of manage, I guess certainly structured development in the city, so that it can be done in a way that's in Europe there's big drive for nature-based solutions, so they build buildings that are kind of take on rainwater and are adapted, and I guess rainwater gardens really work. But like that kind of thing, do you think it would come from a top down to kind of educate in that way?
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. So I think it has to be top down, but more importantly, bottom up. Because a lot of the times, like I said, the rules are there, so they say you can't put up a building without getting a license. And ideally, before you get a license for a structure, then the government has to come in and check How is this building going to affect the environment as it is already? How is it going to affect the roads and things like that? But that happens at the lowest level, because if you leave it to the federal government, it will be very difficult for federal agencies to do that. So it's actually best suited for the local government authorities or the state government authorities to exert that regulatory power. But what happens is that the enforcement isn't really strong. And another thing is, even if you were to say, for instance, that people have to build houses to certain specifications and people cannot build those houses to that specification, maybe because they don't have the money to do so, then what happens? That's how the informal settlements develop, for instance. So there has to be the different organs of government or levels of government have to work together. But I think that, so in terms of the funding, the probably has to be more from the federal government, because the federal government is more buoyant financially than the local government. But in terms of the enforcement, in terms of the monitoring, it has to come more from the local, the lowest level of government, because they are closer to the problem and they understand better the possible solutions around. So different levels of government have to work together. But I'm not sure, or I do not think that a top-down system would be most suited for the problem as it is now.
For those listening online, can I just tell you that you're warmly welcome to submit your questions through the online facility. Do participate in the discussion.
It appears enforcement of the environmental laws is a big issue. And is there a way to strengthen that, the enforcement? Because people tend to look for quick fixes for things, and even when they know that cooperative will be better for their personal benefits, they will want to go for the quick fix. So, but if the enforcement is strong, because of the laws and the punishments, they wouldn't want to spend more because of that. So do you think there's a way to strengthen the enforcement? The local, maybe starting from the local level.
Thank you very much. I think it's interesting that you've raised that point. So there's this issue of how to manage commons, like common resources, and there's always this debate between command and control, enforcement, sanctions, and then self-regulation. So those are the extremes, and then in between you have different durations. But the tragedy of the commons is usually spoken about in terms of, think about it, you have a field, right? Luscious green field, and then everyone's allowed to bring in one cattle at a time. So if we all bring in one cattle at a time, we know that it'll be fine. There'll be no problems. The field will regenerate quickly enough, and then we can keep on using it for as long as we want to. But at some point, someone else brings in another one. So people keep introducing one at a time, and there are no consequences, at least not to them. Instead, there are benefits for them because they're able to feed more cattle at no cost, no extra cost to them. But then we all bear the loss. So that is the main problem with these kinds of issues like flooding. Now, the government can decide to then bring in a sanction to say that if you bring in an extra cattle, you get a fine, for instance, or a prison term or something like that. So that is what you are suggesting. But then it still boils down to enforcement. So if I bring in the extra cattle, how do you make me people fine? It's not automatic. There has to be a mechanism in place to ensure that once I step in with the cattle, I get punished as a way of deterring me. The other issue is the sanction has to be at a level that actually outweighs the benefits I derive from bringing in that extra cattle. So if it is not set at that level, then I wouldn't mind. I'll keep bringing in the cattle because I know that it's still cheaper for me to bring in the cattle than to feed the cattle elsewhere. And there's also, in practical terms, there's also the issue of how to balance the sanctions with, because we live in liberal societies. So how to balance the sanctions with this whole issue of rule of law, democracy, and ensuring that people do not think that the state is being high-handed. So it's a very thin, because when we think about environmental problems, it almost seems like the stiffer the penalty, the better. But imagine if you lived in a country where you had very stiff, at some point everyone would think, but that's too much. Because interestingly, people will think that's too much once the problem has calmed down. So people will not make a connection between the fact that it is this stiff penalty that has led to this okay situation. So there's that problem of the right balance and then even enforcement in this context. Because if you have the penalties or the sanctions, but you don't enforce, then it's a problem. On the other spectrum, people also say, okay, you could use market instruments. So for instance, you could make people pay more or something. So it's not punitive, but it's just a way of deterring people still without applying, strict sanctions of imprisonment or whatever criminal sanctions they need. But then that also raises issues because when you do that, it almost seems like those who are rich would keep benefiting, whereas those who are poor will continue to suffer. So if, for instance, you have a law that says, okay, nobody should build here so that it doesn't cause flooding, but if you want to build here, you can pay £1,000. Then clearly someone may come and decide, I really want to build here. I have £1,000 to pay, and the person pays and walks away. So that doesn't solve the problem because at the end of the day, you have clearly opened room for people to sort of play the system by paying. So enforcement can be strengthened, but the way to do it will depend on the local context. So for instance, in this case, one almost first thing that comes to mind is empower or ensure that the local authorities can actually enforce the law as they are at the moment. But that's easier said than done. So the issue will then be how do we empower these local authorities to do this? Because sometimes you find that when these problems occur, those who have power, even sometimes people have to find alternative routes. So for instance, with that road, nobody passes there anymore, so you have to pass somewhere else. And then those who live on those alternative routes who are powerful just block the routes and say no one's going to pass through here. And nobody can do anything about it. So there are all those issues. So in terms of enforcement, it is also almost easier to get a buy-in from the people. And that is where we talked about the credible pathways, because sometimes it's easier to enforce when people see the need and people see the benefits of complying with certain rules. So in addition to actually empowering the local authorities to enforce, there would also be the knowledge aspect or the part of building some kind of interest in the local people, an understanding of what the problem is, and an understanding of why they should get involved in solving the problem, and then trying to build their commitments. So I guess that's another way of doing it, or another way, it's not an exclusive way, but it's something that should go hand in hand. So empower the local authorities towards enforcement, but also ensure that there's participation by the local people so that they understand why this is a problem, and they probably even become enforcers in themselves. Because if they understand and then they see the need to not do this or not do that, then chances are that they will be better at actually enforcing the law, and they'll be able to complement the efforts of the formal law enforcement authorities.
So I wish to ask to differ a bit. This presentation, I don't know if you contacted the local authorities to talk to them and hear their own side of the story. Because sometimes within us, the academic sector, the discussion goes very well. But we need the real people who are supposed to solve the problem. We get it from them, and that would be a good angle from looking at practical solutions. Because we only look at it from the scholar point is different from what the councillor, because if you look at it in those places where they have flooding, if you give a general presentation to the councillors from that area, it will keep them working, and would like to talk to the people they are representing at the level of the council. So I think it would be good to create that relationship to show them the results of what the scientists are doing. So try to get input from them to, improve on what we are doing.
Thank you very much. I think that's an excellent contribution, and in fact, is the next phase of the work. So that's why, for instance, for me, I have come up with those pathways, and I intend to actually test it out with them. I already started making contacts with them, and at the moment in Benin, for instance, they are actually introducing a new urban planning law. So it's at the House of Assembly at the moment. So I've looked through the bill, and it's really not much different from what has always been. So there's still a focus on the technical aspects of it. and there's still a focus on licensing, permits, things like that. So it really hasn't changed much. So I'm mindful of that, and I'm mindful that it is very important to ensure that this doesn't stop here, and that's part of why I'm here. Because like I mentioned in the beginning, I want to be able to get input, not just from, because I've looked at it from a social legal perspective, but of course I'm sitting with my cap as a lawyer and then my cap as somebody who is into sustainability. But I also want to see how best we can bring in other disciplines as well, because like I mentioned, we can't go at it from one angle only. So it's important for the buying, but we can't dismiss the fact that the emphasis on technical solutions is really deep. So even because I mean, at the end of the day, even the funding that comes in, the funding would usually be construct this or construct that. How do you convince a funder, for instance? How do you measure? So let's take measuring. So if you got funding to work on non-technical factors, how do you measure that you're actually making progress? So sometimes that's difficult to measure. So part of this work is to also understand how one can actually sell that non-technical aspect as a solution. And part of it would be to see how you can tell them, okay, you can measure outcomes by this or that or the other. So it's a long-term project, as it were. So this is just a preliminary phase that has looked into understanding what is on the ground, and what are the possible ways of transforming what is on the ground to something that would be more desirable in the context of addressing this problem. And it will involve different stakeholders. So beyond the academia, it would involve, very importantly, the people, of course, because when we talk about the corporation, who's going to cooperate? It's the people, and at the different levels, the people meaning the local communities, but also the businesses, because like we've seen, a lot of the problems have come from businesses actually trying to protect themselves from the problem and then compounding the issue for the residents in the area. And there has to be a synergy between this, different actors working together. So it would involve the people, it would involve the local governments, it would involve practically everybody, but it's a phased work. So this is just the first phase that shows what is on the ground and what could possibly be the steps forward. Thank you.
Okay, I see a couple of hands now.
Can I ask on behalf of Olanike, who's attending through the webinar, who has two questions, and I think you've just answered the first one, that sounds like it will be addressed in the next phase of your work. But the question is, I'm aware that there are underpinning political factors behind the degrading effects of flooding in Benin City. Can you shed further light on that? I'm not sure if that will be something that comes up in the next phase.
Okay.
The second question is, have you come across any gender-specific issues associated with knowledge sharing and cooperation in fostering effective adaptation strategies in your research?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Annika, for the question. So in terms of underlying political issues, yes, that's very, there's something I didn't mention. Maybe I should go back to it. So this problem actually started because some people blocked, the flow of the water into their own land, as it were. This across the road is an SMT, is a military barrack. So the water used to just flow, and it used to flow into their land, and of course they weren't happy about it. So they did something which then stopped the water from flowing into their land, and that was how this problem actually escalated. So when we talk about the underlying political issues, I guess that's what Olanike is referring to, because the problem then is who's going to talk to the military about this? And people have actually tried, but of course you can imagine that it didn't turn out so well. And then even I think sometime last year, the State House of Assembly declared a state of emergency on this road. So the federal government is aware, the national government is aware, but then the army barracks, that's it. You can see the plants. So it's actually a barrack. They are also, they're part of the government. So those are the underlying issues. And of course, that is why now the local communities have decided to do their own things for themselves, because they can't possibly compel the army, and they see the power dynamics as such that they're almost helpless against the army. So it's best for them to become insular and do what suits them best. And that is why we have this situation here. So those are the underlying issues. It's not just, and that is why it comes back to the fact that the flooding isn't just an environmental problem. Very often, as in this case, there are underlying social issues and of course political issues as well. And then to the second question about gender, yes. So when these meetings occur at the local level, you have, so usually what happens is um, different communities. So you have the landlords, the owners, of properties in that area would come together to try and, find out how best to address the problems. Of course, it would usually be the men who would go and, talk about these solutions. Probably also because it's seen as a technical problem. And usually when you think about technical problems, then it's the men who go forward. Also, probably because it's the men who have access to resources. So if a household is headed by a man, then chances are that it is a man who would represent the household in these meetings. And even where the household is headed by a woman, because of in this community actually, I know a woman who lost her husband. So she's now, the head of the household. But then it's her son who gets invited to the meetings. So there are all those underlying dynamics when it comes to gender. Gender is something that will always be there, whether we like it or not. So of course, an important part of this would be to ensure that the women also get involved, because for instance, if you notice on the left side, those buildings, I don't want to call them shacks, but those buildings, those were actually shops where, local women used to sell food stuff, just petty traders. So that's what they were. Those were petty traders. They would just, put up shops, sell food stuff, things that people around the neighborhood would come and buy. But clearly, with this problem, they all closed shop because nobody would come here to buy anything. And even this shop was owned by a woman. So this one she built in front of her house. This is a better structure than the other shops I showed you before now. So she just built this in front of her house. But she also can't do this anymore because of the flooding problem. So there are gender dynamics in the sense that women need to get involved in actually designing the solutions. And then women have to get involved in also implementing the solutions, because at the end of the day, they are affected by the problem. I can't say whether they are more affected than men, because that's not something I've looked into actively. But I know that, speaking from my observation, the people who have businesses along the line where this problem occurs now, at least in the in-road, are women. But of course, the businesses that are affected on the major road, like the petrol stations, the markets, and all those other businesses, are mostly run by men. So it has gender implications, but I think we should think about the gender implications more, because women are likely going to be excluded from the management process and reaching the solution, but they have to be actively involved as well. Because if any solution has to be reached, for instance, in addressing that problem with the women who have the shops along there, they have to be involved, because they would be directly affected by whatever solutions come up. So it's something that needs to be taken into consideration in reaching a solution.
So question.
Hi, thank you very much. That was really interesting presentation. You mentioned it a couple of times now about the fact that lots of people focus on their individual benefits, and you want them to focus more on the collective benefit. But you've also said that actually they think that they're focusing on their own individual benefits, but there's tons of things like water and other health issues that their individual benefiting actions actually produce negative effects on them. I was sort of I'm a health economist, and the way that we think about things a lot of the time is about providing the evidence for what gives the most value, and in doing that we have to think about different people's perspectives. So what is the most valuable for one person is not necessarily the most valuable for the next person from their different perspectives. But I think maybe that it's useful to think about those different perspectives along the way. And I also think it might be useful to obviously demonstrate. You said that knowledge is a really key thing for this, but to demonstrate to people that actually those collective benefits, they're not just collective benefits, they're actually individual benefits as well. So maybe this is the next part of your program, but I just wondered if you thought about ways in which you might do that to show people that actually those collective benefits are individual benefits. And I guess the strategies that you might use would be different for different groups of
Thank you very much. Yes, so that's actually very key. And so if you look at, for instance, those who have carried out projects or conducted themselves in a way that has compounded the problem, it's usually those who are more powerful. And so what they see as their benefits, as a collective benefit, may not really. So for instance, the barracks, the army barracks, now the flood doesn't affect them in quotes. And the reason it doesn't affect them is because of what they've done, they're able to, so there's a way they're able to drive from the part of the road just before the flood starts, and they drive into the barracks. If it has to be, they can even go one way just to avoid that. And because they are who they are, they can't be stopped. So it's it's true that at the end of the day, the collective benefit is for everyone, really, even in terms of individuals. But then again, there are other intervening factors. The fact that, first of all, some of these people are powerful enough to almost convert the collective, to almost protect themselves from the collective bads or ills, as it were, even though in the real sense they can't do that. Then there's also, because the economic problems, the economic losses in that community, it affects everybody. If we see, for instance, that once there are economic issues, loss of productivity, it leads to social ills, then the social ills would affect everyone. It doesn't just affect one person or the other. And then there's also the issue of people discounting the future. So sometimes what happens is people know that by blocking the drain is going to be a bigger problem, but it's not today. It's not going to happen now. Maybe when it happens, I won't even be around, or. So people have all these ways of convincing themselves that it's like with climate change. So people know, well, it may happen, but not today, not tomorrow. And that's almost an excuse not to act, when one should act. And that is why the government still has a role, because it's the government that has that power to be able to bring in this diverse interest, bring them together and find a way of synergizing them. And the government also has the power to actually almost force the people to come together and see the benefits of acting and protecting the collective interest now. Because if we look at it at a different level, when we talk about collective benefits, it also relates to the fact that the government is responsible for everybody. So whereas individuals may be responsible for themselves and their households, the government is responsible for the collective. So even this road, if we think about it critically, it's supposed to be an asset for the government. So the government should also have an interest in protecting the road against individual, behaviors or practices that actually make the road go bad. So you're right in the sense that this collective has to be thought about also in terms of individuals, and that's something that has to come up, because in terms of the knowledge, that's part of the knowledge sharing that has to come up to try and show people, and also to show evidence. Because for instance, if you have there are places that are better planned and they don't have these problems, so that's an easy example of showing that when people work together and actually put in the right infrastructure and co- conduct themselves in the right ways, they're able to protect themselves from flooding and benefits everybody collectively. So that's something that could be done. But then the next question will be, oh, but those are rich people who can afford to. So there are all those issues that have to be balanced against each other. But definitely, the ideal would be for people to understand that the collective benefits are actually benefits for themselves as individuals as well.
Attendees. This is from Marcelin. He asks, to what extent do you think the effectiveness of proposed social networks in enhancing adaptation strategies would be affected or not by the practical challenge in understanding the varying levels of responsibility and policy that you were talking about earlier, so the federal, state and local authority levels?
So to what extent will the social networks be affected by that?
Yeah, how effective or not it will be as a result of that.
All right. Thank you very much. So I think already there's an understanding that when it comes to resource management, decisions need to be taken at the lowest level possible. So I think that already promotes, social network building, because the social networks we're talking about are actually at the lowest level or at the grassroots level. So it doesn't mean that the federal government or the state government automatically loses responsibility or is automatically absolved from every responsibility. But like I think I'd mentioned this earlier, there would be different levels of responsibility for different things. So for instance, if the federal government already is more or less the one who demarcates the jurisdictions. So this is federal land, or this is state land, and this is local land. So the federal government has that level of almost setting the pace, for the policy and the regulatory practices, and then possibly also some level of funding for the activities. The state government has the responsibility for now enforcing these policies, and then possibly also funding to an extent. But I think when it comes to actual enforcement, monitoring, then the local level becomes key. And when it even comes to building the social networks, because if we're building the social networks at the lowest level, then the level of government that is closest to the people would then be very instrumental to ensuring that these networks actually work, and would also be instrumental to ensuring the enforcement and compliance, compliance by the social networks. Because of course, the fact that you have a social network doesn't automatically mean that they will be doing things that benefit the collective good. So there still have to be some way of ensuring that the activities of the networks are geared towards improving the collective good. And this is where the government still comes in, to check excesses, to promote, to give incentives, for positive behavior and all that. Otherwise, you could have a case where one or two groups hijack the process and we still come back to this problem, of competition. Because the issue of competition isn't necessarily an individual thing, but it could also be a group thing. Because we also had cases where, for instance, if you look at the barracks as a collective, it's also part of the problem. So it's a collective in the sense that they are all one community. They understood the problem, they understood their role in addressing the problem, but they decided they weren't going to do that anymore. And instead, they were going to protect their land. Incidentally, that empty land that used to act as a sink, they now rent it out to people for social events. So I guess for them, there was an economic benefit they could derive from protecting the land, and they went ahead and did it, and no one can complain. So the social network in itself may not be the solution if these other enabling factors aren't there, and so the government still plays a role at the lowest level, but at the federal level, there's function at the state level. So it's about the different levels of government working together, to promote the collective good, and then working with the social networks or the lowest level, such that even at that level, they become enforcers, they believe in the reason for this, and then they work towards it together.
Are there any final questions or comments? If not, I have one.
Okay.
So in your kind of proposal, so it's obvious that at the local level, at the federal level, at the state level, the kind of the authorities are kind of failing to address the problem adequately. Now, in your proposal, you are emphasizing the role of individuals and individual households to kind of join forces and start addressing, build social networks and address the problem collaboratively. I think my question is how already existing kind of social structures and community structures actually can be used. So you seem to suggest that we need to start building these networks now, but aren't there already social networks and structures in place that could be used for this purpose?
Okay. Thank you very much. So I think the idea behind this was actually to show what's actually being done. So that means there's already, the network. So people already exist in the network, and then the idea was to try and understand how to try and almost conceptualize the different kinds of actions they take, to give a big picture. So you have this, like I said, the association of landlords, people who live in a certain area coming together, and then they decide, okay, let's do this. And then I characterize it as isolation, or I characterize it as competition, or whatever it is. So the networks already exist. But I think that beyond their existence, and that's why I try to understand how or what makes them effective or non-effective, or what could be part of the factors that make them either effective or non-effective. And one factor that I think everyone more or less agrees on is the technical aspect. So if they have the right technology, for instance, we assume that that solves the problem. But I'm proposing that beyond that technical aspect, there's also the non-technical aspect. which means that is where the knowledge comes in, which means that even as this network exists, we can better strengthen their responses by the kind of knowledge they have, and then by also building up their capacity to actually even enforce. So the networks exist, but I think their role can be enhanced. And part of the enhancement would be by ensuring that they have, the right level of knowledge, and then they also have not the right level of knowledge, but maybe the right kind, the right understanding of, because environmental uncertainties are there, they won't go away, and they apply to every kind of knowledge. And I'm saying this because I don't want to come across as saying that the local people do not have knowledge or do not understand. They do understand, but there has to be a way of combining, first of all, the formal science, which is what the government, the laws are based on, with the practices, and to see how they can be synergized, integrated to reach the collective good. So the networks exist, they can be enhanced, and part of the enhancement would be through knowledge and then through capacity building to ensure that the outcomes are actually positive, and benefit the collective as against benefiting the individual networks or their areas of operation.
I was reminded listening to your presentation that the difference between Leeds and Berlin actually might not be that big. I think it's 2 years ago, right, that in the Christmas holiday, one of the major roads into Leeds, Crookston Road, got flooded because the river, the water level in the river was up too much. And then since then, there has been, for the past 2 years, there has been a kind of rivalry between the local government and the national government about who is developing the plan to address the problem, who is paying for those plans, etc. And actually, certain businesses have been relocating as a result to prevent their own risks, etc. So actually, it breaks this idea that this is a third world problem or a global south problem. Actually, I mean, at a different scale and for different reasons. But the questions about whose responsibility is this and how can those kind of issues be addressed are very similar. So,
interesting.
So, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much for being part of the seminar.